Hi, thank you. Right, I know has given you the methodological paper. I'm going to give you the pedantic one. Point out, while we're here, let me be very pedantic, just in case anybody buttonholes Mike Jones. This is Mike Botany Jones, not Mike Climate Change Jones. So don't talk to Mike, he won't know anything. Well, he might do, but he doesn't know anything about this particular project. Okay. We got integrated biodiversity impact assessment, and the purpose of this contract was primarily to integrate appropriate assessment with SEA and EIA there, and we talked about the outline, gave an outline of this first steps at Puebla in a few papers. The pedantic bit comes from, if you have a process called integrated biodiversity impact assessment, to me that means it integrates everything to do with biodiversity. So the issue is, does it cover general biodiversity? Because there's a distinction between that and what we in Ireland call appropriate assessment, Natura regulations assessment here. So does it cover the general diversity irrespective of any interest from EIA or SAA and irrespective of the Natura 2000 and the appropriate assessment interests? Potential gaps in the EU legislation, which are primarily historical. The Convention on Biodiversity popularised, of course, the term biodiversity from 1992 onwards. In the same way sustainable development became a buzzword at that particular time. So you won't find it in previous legislation. It's not mentioned in the EIA directive, even after the EIA directive was amended, although there was more specific consideration of habitats from 97-11 onwards. It is mentioned in the SEA directive, and I find it interesting. The SEA directive keeps the flora and fauna of the EIA directive, but adds biodiversity to that, implying that biodiversity is more than just flora and fauna. So this is just an issue of chronology. And the sort of reaction as well, tied up with this, which is driving me here, and which Rose Slifig and company mentioned in their book, which is Natura 2000 and appropriate assessment is a bit of fortress conservation mentality. I've drawn this, and I'm thinking about a bigger picture and whether there's any way of trying to get this taken on board. Not all the potential damage to the environment is caught by EIA, obviously, because you're looking at specific projects, and the damage may not be related to a project in the EIA sense. And EIA is notorious in not dealing with low-level cumulative effects. SEA is somewhat better, and it's, I think Barry was saying this morning, it's quite often advertised as being better for dealing with cumulative effects, but it does require that the actions you're talking about are framed by, in a few cases, a policy, but in most of the EU by a plan or a program. So whatever you're assessing has either got to be framed by a project or a plan or a program. Now there are some situations, of course, and the directive applies, the SEA directive applies to this, where the plan or program leads directly onto projects, and you can see a connection there. There are some other ways in which the plan or program will lead on directly to actions which wouldn't be part of a project. And an Irish example would be farm-scale afforestation, where grants that they make available to farmers would allow them to plant 5 hectares below the forestry threshold. And yet we're seeing in some localities, counties Cavan and Monaghan, disappearing under trees. In 30 years' time it will be wall-to-wall trees, and that's never been assessed. And the only way to assess that is to assess the policy that release the money to the farmers, and it's never been looked at. So we got those. Now, from that point of view, appropriate assessment is wrongly focused because it's dealing with endangered, specialist, localized species and habitats, and in some cases you make a strong argument these are sometimes species that are on their last legs. Remember, the biological lifespan of the species averages at about 10 million years, and some of these have been around for 9 3/4. Says he rather provocatively. General biodiversity slips away. That's the argument. Some of the things that missed, and I can think of field boundary removal in an Irish context, an ecologically important network. You might think you can get down to that by lowering the EIA threshold and calling that a project. And we've attempted to do this in Ireland, coming out of these new regulations. in an attempt to get away from the whole deluge of ECJ judgments, one after another, all of which say the same thing, that we haven't done any legislation properly. And the threshold for field boundary removal is coming down to 4 hectares. Well, some of our farms haven't got 4 hectares. And these farmers are the very low, intensity farms that might have some of the more interesting wildlife associated with them. Coming to a European conference, we have to slip in a fairly complicated diagram. The important thing I'm bearing in mind here, though, interaction here, biodiversity. This is the one that really is I think, the core of the issue. Traditional land uses. How do those sort of things fit together? And the biodiversity that survives is related to those. Cumulative effects assessment is another sort of approach for trying to deal with this, looking at the valued ecosystem and the valued environmental components, the VECs. And that has led on, of course, to the development of ecosystem service linked SCA, focusing on the human perspective and equitable use of the environment, and attempting to, this is my paraphrase, defeating the tragedy of the commons through enlightened self-interest and controlled exploitation of the environment. Again, I argue that doesn't work in our context. It doesn't work in Ireland, and being English, it doesn't work in England, in my estimation. It might work in relation to one particular ecosystem component, and that is water. And the way of approaching that is through the Water Framework Directive. But the general problem is that in our islands, the Irish can't call them the British Isles over there, you have to call them these islands. In our islands, there is no land which is not in direct ownership of people or companies. There is no accessible Commonwealth to the ordinary people in the same way that you can argue for ecosystem-related SEA in less developed countries. Apart from water, I would argue that the 2 most important valued ecosystem components in Ireland and in Britain are pollinators and biological pest control. And anybody who wants to find out about the power of biological pest control, investigate the contribution that Killer Sparrow campaign had to the Great Famine in China following the Great Leap Forward. You know, an organism we don't rate very highly was a massive input into the survival of food production. Rural land use agriculture initially favoured biodiversity. Wall-to-wall trees are a limited habitat. Creating spaces in them would increase biodiversity, but now the biodiversity tends to be relegated to semi-natural islands in a sea of agriculture. Some of these are still of significant interest, but they might rely on outmoded practices. And the whole catalogue of, in the European context, there's a whole catalogue of cultural landscape sites, small scale, which depend on particular forms of agricultural practice which are no longer economic. And the legal enforcement framework is lacking. The other problem, as I see it, and Amanda sort of set the stage for this by saying, was the plan designed to be good for the Natura site? In which case we don't assess it. And yet we have a history in conservation of good conservation ideas which prove not to work. I would always argue that plans with positive intent should certainly be assessed, just to make sure you've got the positive intent. You've actually got the right ideas about what you're doing. And the argument here ties up with the AgriEnvironmental Scheme in Ireland. It's now closed off, lack of money. Rural Environmental Protection Scheme, but it was not subjected to EIA. One of our colleagues as a civil servant made me remove the word deliberately from avoided by the government, but I believe it was deliberately avoided by the government. They recognised it was a plan, but they said, oh no, it's positive, therefore we're not going to assess it. They didn't do any assessment, and when the EU came saying, prove that the money you spent is working, oh, well, we got this many farmers taking this much money, doesn't that prove it? I had to refit it. I said it's not just Ireland, there are these other examples, the agri-environmental schemes are not working. And then, of course, on top of that, we've got the problems with islands. Ireland is an island with 2 jurisdictions, but they're working under similar sort of situations. We're under pressure from invasive species, as all island communities are, and that's difficult to assess. the integrated biodiversity assessment process, you can see a mechanism whereby it could tie in the legislation relating to deliberately commercial introductions, reintroduction of extinct species, quarantine of biological materials that might be contaminated, introduction of ornamental plants and pets. We're having a problem with the Siberian chipmunk. The owners have died and the chipmunk's running around quite happily. Biological control agents and possibly relating to GMOs, although of course they'll never be allowed to be grown in Ireland. The argument sort of looking at, in terms of the more general biodiversity, is perhaps we need to look at regional VECs, and the paper sort of got mention of something in Europe as well, but I'm going to stick with this example. The Borough in North County, Clare limestone pavement. The VEC here is species-rich grassland, which depends on a particular style of agriculture, which is outmoded. It's non-economic for the farmers. One of the success stories here was a project which actually researched the component, found out what it was about the old practice that maintained the system, find scientifically based replacement techniques for that, convinced the local farmers that they could go down this and could still survive economically, and then put it in place, and that has moved on from being a research project to being a project with application, and the local community of that. This is definitely involving the local community. So I'm arguing that what we need, it's not easy to tie this in with SEA, but we need a cumulative effects process. We need to look at the impacts which are outside of the standard EIA net, things that don't necessarily derive from plans, programs or projects which are subjected, or policies, programs or projects subjected to SEA. And perhaps at the end of the day, the ultimate thing is an environmental management system model where each land user has to have an environmental management plan subject to an EMS. And of course, that scheme would require SEA because it was even though it was designed to be a positive scheme. And that's where the SEA would come back into the picture at the end of the day. So I said, you know that bit. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all for staying. It's, the last presentation of the night before the conference dinner is probably not a really good time to be giving a talk, so thank you for staying. I'm going to talk to you about Australia's national environmental law, strategic assessments that are done under it, and the integration here that we're talking about is the integration of SEA with the planning processes that are happening in the different states and territories. And I'll use some examples and talk about some lessons learned. I'll do a bit of background to start off with because it's different than the EU, and so it's just putting you in the context of our decision-making framework and where we're actually starting from. So Australia is a federal system. We have a number of states. They have certain jobs, and we have certain jobs at a national level. I work for the Commonwealth government. Just to give you a bit of the perspective, that's the size of the Czech Republic. In terms of the states of Australia, they're large, they're very poorly populated in some cases, but they have a lot of mineral resources and other attributes that people are very glad to be involved with. There was an agreement done between the states and the territories and the Commonwealth government about what the Commonwealth would look after, and they identified a number of matters of national environmental significance. We don't do air quality, we don't do water quality, we don't do some of the attributes. It's not a holistic environmental assessment at a strategic or a project level. It's about things which the national government has treaties with other parties with, Ramsar wetlands, biodiversity conservation, World Heritage areas, those things that have an international perspective to them that is a Commonwealth responsibility. The act that we operate under describes our role in protecting the environment and heritage with regard to the matters of national environmental significance. There are procedures for project level EIA, and there's also procedures, and increasingly it's becoming operable provisions for strategic environmental assessment. these are the matters of national environmental significance. I won't read them all, but you can see from those of you who are involved in this area, they are those types of things that have an international component to them. The one that's probably different is the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. It is a World Heritage Area, and it is a trigger. It is a consideration in its own right. In the past, with this act and with the Commonwealth's perspective on environmental assessment, we were getting project by project assessments. We were getting them after the state had done their plans and said that that area was all right for X. And then we get somebody walking along who wanted to do a particular type of development, the X, and we'd say, but you're on a matter of national environmental significance, you can't go there. So we were having this conflict with not only the states, but the developers. So we were caught in a bit of a jam. That also didn't enable us as a nation to have a conversation about environmental attributes at a landscape scale, or to be able to deal with the cumulative impacts on those matters of national environmental significance. So the strategic environmental assessment legislation was in the Act when it was passed, and it was voluntary. It only gave the Commonwealth a tick. The Commonwealth could endorse somebody's plan, policy, or program. So you can imagine how well that worked. It didn't work at all. No one wanted to be bothered for that. In 2007, they made amendments to our Act to say that if you went through a strategic environmental assessment, the minister could also approve actions and classes of actions that were taken in accordance with the plan, policy, or program that had been endorsed. That was in terms of national environmental law. You wouldn't need any further environmental assessment. So as you can imagine, as well, that got people's interest. The state started coming to us, and in terms of streamlining red tape, getting better environmental outcomes, and also understanding better those cumulative impacts, we've been able to work much more collaboratively and to better outcomes with the states. So that's our map again of Australia. You can see that we have one in every state and territory, and 2 in Western Australia. There are a range of different plans, policies, and programs. A number of them are the major capitals, the major metropolitan areas, about the urban planning that's associated with those capitals of Sydney, Melbourne, and now Perth. We just signed up Perth recently. We've got 2 smaller urban developments, one in Queensland and one in the capital. And we've got 2 interesting ones that are more policy-based. There's one about the prescribed burning process that for fire protection and ecological burning that's done in South Australia. So they've got a whole suite of plans and policies and programs that they use to tell them when to burn and how to burn and who burns and why you burn and where you burn and all that kind of stuff. And that's what we're strategically assessing. And in Tasmania, we're looking at an irrigation program. And it's not only the irrigation program itself, like a project, but it's all those farmers and how they make decisions and what actually, because it's dryland farming now, they're going to irrigation. What are the impacts on the critically endangered listed grasslands? And that's another suite of policies and decision-making tools that the country's using. So in those, you can start to see then the nexus. The integration that I'm talking about is that integration with the state processes. So we're integrating really closely. We're looking at things that suggest that we can get a clear planning, working with the states and territories to identify a clear planning framework that actually identifies those national matters up front, builds on them, and works to ensure that the processes the state has will protect in an ongoing way the things for which we're responsible. We're very much, sometimes you don't know, so we're basing it on a risk basis. What are the risks to the matters of national environmental significance? What are the processes that they've got in place to deal with those risks? We don't have to know exactly where they are. We don't yes, baseline data's there, but it's probably not the first question that you'd ask. You'd ask, what's the system that's there? What's the overall system? You wouldn't have to know whether there was a frog there, you'd have to know there was habitat for a frog. To is kind of coming up to perhaps just a slightly risk-based level. I'm going to use a couple of case studies, primarily Melbourne. Melbourne is the first one that's actually gone through endorsement and approval of actions. So in the Melbourne case study, there's, it's a city of 3 million now. They want to go to 5, and their lands that they had set aside wouldn't get them that far. Over to the west of Melbourne, it's rather divided basalt plateaus with some listed grassland community on it. They'd never gone that way. It wasn't very attractive. It was dry and ugly, which meant the grasslands were in pretty good shape. So to the west and the north, that's where that is. And then down to the south, there is areas where there's some other threatened species as well. It's 20 years growth for a major metropolitan capital. It's 284,000 homes, a major railway, a major urban road, and then there's a number of smaller sites within it. So what we did here was we looked really clearly about what we were looking for in terms of the EPBC is our act, regional conservation outcomes that this program could provide. It's a program of activities and things that they were going to do. And I'm sure that you've probably used the kind of process trilogy as well of about avoiding and mitigating and offsetting. Over here to the west where the grasslands were, they actually changed the urban boundary based upon the quality of the grasslands. They avoided the best grasslands in deciding their urban location, and they also, when in avoiding them, they were able to then set aside those areas as an offset for those areas of grasslands that would be within the blue areas will be cleared. The integration is actually incorporating the national matters within the triggers and the considerations of the state planning system. And it actually dictates how you do things. They have a number of levels of planning, probably similar to what your authorities have. They've got a regional plan, a structure plan, precinct plans, and then allotment plans. You probably have something similar. In doing that, there's actually, for those different matters of NES, there's prescriptions for each one of the different species and how they'll use them and what they'll do with them at regional level, the structure plan level, and the precinct level. So what we're trying to say here is that we're trying to front-end load the planning system to cater for the matters of national environmental significance. That's in the endorsed plan. People then, the minister's been giving approvals of classes of actions, which is urban development, but that urban development can only be undertaken as long as it's done in conjunction, in accordance with the endorsed plan. This enables a landscape scale focus instead of getting project by project work, and it also gives really good clarity to the developers and the local planning authorities. They know what the rules are. Nobody's going to change. You don't come in at the last moment and get said, actually there's a frog there. It's quite clear to everybody what's happening. To the west of the Melbourne, when we were talking about what's happening, the national park that has been set aside as an offset is 15,000 hectares of grassland, which, in the scale that some of you are probably working, it takes from 2% that's currently protected to 20% of total grasslands that are available. So it's also gives us confidence that what we're signing off is the best of the best, the good protection for those particular matters of national environmental significance. Another case study will take you away from Melbourne, take you clear up to the Kimberley in the north of Australia. Here there's offshore gas, and the strategic approach, the landscape scale outcomes were based on, there was a number of companies involved in the acreage that wanted to extract the gas that's in the Browse Basin. The state and the Commonwealth agreed that rather than having all these proponents finding their own site along this beautiful, pristine wilderness coast, they would work a collaborative, collective process. So here again, we're integrating with planning to identify the best technically feasible, economically affordable, and environmentally and culturally appropriate spot for one LNG hub on the Kimberley coast. And this is the one which I don't know whether anybody's ever seen some of the travel logs on the Kimberley coast, but it's absolutely stunning. So that doesn't look too bad, but in Kimberley terms, it's not all that great. So, and there's an indigenous issues, lots of indigenous issues in that place as well. Another one about our utilizing SEA practice to make a difference is about remaining engaged. So we don't just drop and go. It's not a set and forget. It's about actually maintaining a role in a regulatory manner and making sure that the adaptive management plans that they've incorporated into their plans that have been endorsed are actually undertaken. They must monitor and report. They must have an independent audit every 5 years about how that plan is going. Did they do what they said they were going to do? And was that the right thing to do? And if it isn't the right thing to do, we'll fine-tune the prescriptions for the different matters of national environmental significance. We'll look through what else needs to happen. Because we're signing off on 20 to 30 years worth of an activity. So you don't get it and then get to look at it. It happens incrementally. So you need to be watching what's happening. Another way of making a difference is working really closely collaborative with governments, community, and with industry's experts in the non-government sector. We've had some really interesting conversations because you can step up. You're not looking at a project, you're looking at that planning scale. And particularly with Indigenous persons, they really get that at that scale. We've reduced the regulatory burden. We figured that the Melbourne strategic assessment would, otherwise if it was project by project, we'd have about 210 referrals. We've done some cost-benefit analysis and figured that there's about 2.6 million for the Australian government and private sector savings that don't have to be done by having independent EIAs. And also the clarity that the industry has and the certainty that comes to the industry. There's good and bad. Because you're actually looking at a landscape scale outcome, you're also looking at a landscape scale impact. So all the little impacts that you might not pick up, you actually have to account for. So the numbers you get are really big. It scares the bejesus out of the poor minister, when you say to him, this is what you're signing off on. It's quite a scary consideration. This is what you get, this is what you lose. And it's the whole of what you lose. So what are some of the lessons we've learned? Communicating the value intent is really essential to stakeholders, to the industry, to the minister, to understand what are the expectations with the partners when you commence it, what are the expectations with other stakeholders around the table. It's a bit like voting, engage early, engage often. You get in there and have really good conversations with people up front. And particularly the community. It's really resource intensive. I have a staff of 40 people for those sites that you saw around the country. So it's important that we're involved. They're specialists. They're PhDs in everything from sociology to ecology. And the time frames are important. It takes a long time to do some of these, particularly like the Kimberley one where was a site identification process as well as an assessment process. Melbourne was done in 12 months because they were planning at the same time, and all the documents went out for public consultation together. Where are we going now? One of the reasons I've just had 2 wonderful days with Maria was doing the planning course on how you could actually incorporate SEA in more of a sustainability development context, because we've been given now some funding to undertake regional sustainability plans in areas of high growth, so that we're really ahead of the game. So we'll be in there planning and then doing strategic assessments on them. We want to engage the private sector when they're doing multiple developments in an area. We can do a strategic environmental assessment with them, and we're really trying to understand a whole range of different tools and figure out which is the best tool for the best situation. We have a number of other tools under our Act as well, so it gives us some real possibilities. So the integration is about working collaboratively with the states, with communities, government, and industry to get to really good outcomes, hopefully. Thank you.
Thanks, Carolyn. Yeah, I'll let you go a bit longer. We have a bit of time to kill, unless there's going to be a big question session. Does anybody have anything they'd like to ask Carolyn?
Karen, one of the things that I think is important, that SEA is being used as a vehicle ahead of EIA and avoiding the necessity for EIA, which creates incredible incentive to do
at a Commonwealth level.
Yeah.
I want to be really clear about that, because states still deal with noise and air and dust and water quality and all the things, you know, the myriad of things that happen in an EIA has never been part of our national requirements. So, but this deals with, from a national perspective, this planning, this integration and planning process then deals with the requirement for project by project EIA.
Carolyn, when I worked in Canada, we were developing these kinds of agreements between federal and provincial governments on environmental assessment, and some were easier to progress than others. And you know, you ended up coming up against the kind of traditional federal provincial conflict that is part of Canadian life. And I just wondered if you had encountered something similar, or if that hadn't occurred because you were dealing with something that was in the national agreement.
You still have to have they still have to want to agree with you. Mm-hmm. We did Melbourne, we've done Sydney now. It took 2 years to get Perth and Western Australia to the table, because they thought of their own autonomy, their own sovereignty was important. They didn't want the state, the national, the feds in their space. But we would have been in their space project by project, one way or another. It wasn't like we're there more because of strategic environmental assessment. We would have been there anyhow. Melbourne, they wanted us. They came and we worked really good together. We got it done in 12 months. So, you know, you've got a whole perspective of willingness and a real partnership, collaborative approach as compared to a more adversarial. It's a bit like a courtship. You know, you kind of you're having these conversations with them, and then they kind of, you know, get a bit standoffish, and you have to go back. We get there eventually.